Hi, welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today I want to talk about my NO ID Phal collection. When I first got into orchids, the Phalaenopsis was the first orchid that caught my eye. After a few attempts at growing orchids from the supermarket, I really wanted to experiment. In the beginning, I knew I didn't have a green thumb, so I didn't want to spend too much money on plants that were going to die. Locally, I found a business that was selling orchids after they bloomed out. Basically, they came back from business accounts and the plants no longer had flowers or the flowers were dying. So they sold them for about $2 each. I got a selection of 10 to try out. I knew that if these plants died, I wouldn't be too sad, but if I got some success with them, I knew I can continue to grow orchids, and 3 or 4 years later, I still have a couple that have survived and made it through all my trials and errors. So I'm going to share with you a couple of those and a few that I've gathered along the way. So let's begin. I had mentioned that I got 10 Phalaenopsis for cheap, and these were the ones that I put into a water culture experiment. Back then when I started, it seemed like everyone was doing water culture, and I just had to jump into the game. So I took the 10 Phalaenopsis that were bloomed out, I removed the flower spikes and cleaned them up, and I just potted them in a small container with some water and let it go. After 6 months, I noticed that the majority of those plants were not doing well, and I was doing something wrong, but I couldn't quite figure out what. Out of the 10 plants, I have 4 still today. So I'm going to share with you how those 4 are doing, and hopefully you'll learn from my mistakes. So here are the 4. The first plant I named Clark. She is one of the strongest and healthiest plants that I had in water culture. When the plant was in water culture, you can tell that there was a difference in growth. The leaves were smaller and thinner than the other leaves. After the 6-month water culture experiment, I took it out and I put it in a bark mix. It had a mix of large bark and perlite, and it was there for about a year. Unfortunately, I also put this plant in lower light conditions, so it wasn't able to bloom. But the roots started to look a lot stronger after it was in bark. Last year, I repotted this plant just to check on the roots. It seemed like it is doing much better. I decided to put a net pot into the larger pot for more aeration. I'm hoping that Clark will stay in this pot for a couple of years before it needs to be repotted again. And it seems to be loving the new setup. This plant also has a lot of aerial roots, and it just cannot be contained. I have no idea what I'm going to do with these roots, but I'm just going to let it go for a while and just ride it out. This plant is leaning over, and it does that due to its natural growing habit. It tends to have its leaves on its side so that if any water hits the leaf or the crown, it'll slide right off. I'm not quite sure I like this look for the plant, so I may have to reset it into an upright habit after it blooms so that it just looks a little bit neater and takes up less space. Clark has gotten a new spike, and it is the most advanced spike I have out of my phals. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing these blooms. After 3 years of experimenting, this one has given me hope that it's finally recovered. The second plant I nicknamed Bellamy. Now after water culture, I put this plant in a community pot with 2 other phals. I was hoping that the 3 can just grow together and it would look great. After a year, Bellamy seemed to dominate the pot. The other 2 phals weren't growing as strongly, so I decided to take them out and just let this plant grow solo. After this plant was left alone, it seemed to be growing tons of roots. It also seemed to be growing a lot of leaves, and it looks quite healthy. So far, it hasn't bloomed yet, and it hasn't even spiked. I might experiment with this one later in the year when the temperature cools down, trying to induce it to spike. I really want to see this one bloom, and I know this one is very healthy and very vigorous. The next plant is Octavian. Now, Octavia was in the community pot with Bellamy. And originally, she was about the same size as Bellamy, but over time she started losing her leaves. So after she was moved out of the community pot into her own pot, she did grow and she spiked. She was the only one of the NO ID Phals to bloom last year. And even though the blooms were not that impressive, it was still a good sign that this plant was pretty healthy. However, when I came to repot this plant, I noticed that it had barely any roots left. So I had to cut off the spike early and repot it. Since then, she's been growing progressively larger leaves. You can tell where I started with water culture because all of the original leaves are gone and only the water culture leaves are left at the bottom. I've noticed that the leaves have started to get larger and larger. Now, the leaves of this plant currently look like the size of a mini phal. But I know that this plant is supposed to be as large as a plain white phal, basically the size of the other two plants. So it has a lot of growing to do before it reaches full maturity and full recovery. I know that this one could spike, but I'm not holding my breath that it'll spike this year. Now, the last No ID phal that I subjected to water culture is Raven. Now, Raven lost all her roots in water culture. She was basically all leaves and a stem. So when I put her in a bark mix, I was very careful not to overwater this plant and just maintain humidity around the root zone to encourage root growth. After a while, I potted her in the community pot with Bellamy and Octavian, but she just stalled. She didn't grow, she didn't rot, she was just kind of in stasis mode. So after I moved her out of the community pot into her own pot, she started to grow much better. She has a pretty good root system and she's growing leaves pretty well. Recently, I decided to repot her in a mix of leca and bark, and I put her in a self-watering pot so she can grow much better. So those are the 4 No ID phals that I subjected to water culture. Now, I said I had 7 plants, so there are a couple that weren't in this water culture experiment, but they also had their own sets of problems while I was learning to grow phals. So 2 of them were gift plants. So the first one I named Abby. She's a large purple Phalaenopsis, and after the blooms had faded, I cut the spike off, I repotted her from moss into bark, and I just let her be. When I was first growing orchids, everyone told me that phals are low light plants, and I believed them. So with Abby, I put her in kind of a low light situation, or what I thought was considered low light. She's healthy, but she didn't bloom. And only recently, and last year, I learned that maybe the phals need a little bit more light if it doesn't bloom. And so I put her in a bright, sunny location, and she's doing much, much better. In fact, she's spiking, and she's on her way to blooming. The spike is not as long as the one on Clark, but it's on its way. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing these ones bloom again after a year of no blooms. The next plant is cane. This is an inherited large white phal. When I got this plant, it was humongous. It had so many roots, it practically had to be in an 8-inch pot. However, I overwatered it during the winter time and it lost a good portion of its roots. But I know that it is a very vigorous grower and it does all it can to grow roots and grow leaves and survive. It put out a lot of aerial roots when the roots in the media were starting to rot. I noticed this and I was trying to do my best to make sure those area roots do well, but I kept knocking them off, I kept breaking them up, and I just prevented the plant from growing well. So I decided to repot cane into this 3D printed computer case that I got. I thought it would be nice and airy and I could fill it with bark and it would just do well in that situation. So it's been there for a little bit over a year and it seems to be doing okay. It's a little bit harder for me to water this plant because there are so many holes everywhere, you can't really soak it. So I know that I had to watch out for this one and water it more often. It still seems to be doing well since it's throwing out so many roots. Now, the last of my No ID phals is a most recent addition. Now, I got this phal, the Tahuku Jasper, last year in June. And it has been the easiest phal to bloom and to keep thus far. And I think that's because I have gotten much better at growing phals. I no longer make the same mistakes, I don't do the crazy experiments, and I just kind of let the plant be and do its own thing. So the phal Tahuku Jasper has beautiful patterning and really compact leaves. I noticed that this plant is very, very thirsty. So it's in a self-watering pot and it's almost always in water. I flush it about once a month just to make sure there's no fertilizer salt buildup. But this plant has been wonderful. It's currently in bloom and it has 1 spike, 2 branches, and 12 flowers. I have not gotten a single one to blast and it's just been so lovely to look at this plant. The Tahuku Jasper has given me so much hope in growing my Phalaenopsis collection that I may end up picking a couple more down the road. So those are my 7 No ID Phalaenopsis. I know that water culture is not for everyone, and I've definitely learned my lesson. I think it just didn't work out for me because of a few things. First, I was using my tap water. And here in Southern California, we have very hard, alkaline, high TDS water that is not good with water culture, since there's no media to buffer it. I think it would be much better off if I used a little bit of sphagnum moss or even some bark to act as a buffer so that my water is not so alkaline and gives it a little bit of acidity so that the plants can uptake all the nutrients it can in a better way. Second of all, in water culture, you're supposed to add a good nutrient solution, and I did not do that. I just used plain water. So without any fertilizer or nutrients, the plants didn't have much to uptake and it didn't do well. And third, the winter time in my old apartment was very cold. It got almost down to 45 degrees, and in water culture, the roots have no protection. I didn't use a heat mat to keep the water warm or the root zone warm, so the roots just got way too cold. It was very wet, and it just allowed for mold, bacteria, and all sorts of things to happen to the plant, and that's why it didn't work for me. There were a lot of nuances to water culture that I didn't realize when I first started out. I just thought, hey, I'll just take a bare root plant, stick it in some water, and watch it grow. And unfortunately, there's a little bit more science and technical aspects to growing plants in water culture. So I've learned my lesson with that one, and I think I'm going to stick with organic media for now. I think the combination of tap water with MSU fertilizer for well water and organic media help make growing orchids easier for me in my Southern California environment. I think it takes out a lot of the technical aspects of growing orchids and makes it a little bit simpler for me to grow plants without doing too much pH adjusting. Organic media seems to work for me because, one, it retains enough moisture to keep these plants hydrated, and it acts as a buffer with my tap water so that the plants can absorb the nutrients at the proper pH without me having to make a pH adjusted solution too often. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel, Attainable Green, for all the latest updates. And hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Bye!